Ben Wattenberg. In the wake of the Cold War, Russia founders. Its economy is broken. There is massive structural corruption and lawlessness. American businesses and politicians are apparently implicated, all of which prompted the New York Times Magazine to ask, who lost Russia? Joining Think Tank to examine Russia's developments since the collapse of the Soviet Union are Lynn, professor of political science at Virginia Commonwealth University and co-author of Radical Reform in Yeltsin's Russia, Political, Economic, and Social Dimensions. Leon Aron, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and author of the forthcoming book, Yeltsin, A Revolutionary Life. And Michael McFaul, senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and author of Russia's 1996 presidential election, The End of Polarized Politics. The topic before the House, is Russia lost? This week on Think Tank. Almost 8 years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia is in trouble. Russia's gross domestic product has fallen almost 50% since 1989. 60 million Russians are said to be living below the nation's poverty line. Life expectancy is down. Disease is up. Billions of dollars have left Russia for greener and safer pastures. Capital flight over the last 7 years is estimated at between $200 billion and $500 billion. The Bank of New York is being investigated for laundering money from the Russian mob. A Swiss construction company is accused of paying credit card bills for Russian President Yeltsin and his family. And Vice President Gore finds his cooperation with former Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin coming under increased scrutiny. What happened? Some blame Western advisors who pushed for so-called shock therapy measures, urging rapid privatization of state-run industries and an end to price controls. Others fault the International Monetary Fund for not properly monitoring its loans to the Russian government. On a more optimistic note, some experts say that what we see in Russia are normal growing pains. The Clinton administration is urging patience. National Security Advisor Sandy Berger recently wrote, "Reform will take a generation or more. To understand corruption in Russia, we must understand that it is rooted in the legacy of Soviet communism." But might not patience carry its own risk? Cash-starved Russia still has a large supply of nuclear warheads and may look to sell them for cash to bad actors on the international scene. Might not the continuing hard economic times give rise to a new nationalism hostile to America and the West? Amidst all this turmoil, Russia is gearing up for elections to parliament in December and a presidential election in June of 2000. A few months later, there will be an American election, and we will hear on the hustings the question, who lost Russia? Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. I want to pose 3 questions during this session. How bad is it over there? Who's to blame? And what comes next? So let's start with that first question and get a quick response around the room. How bad is it in Russia today?
I think you have to ask 2 different kinds of questions to answer the big question about how bad it is in Russia. First, compared to what? And second, what question are you seeking an answer to? That long list that you started the program with about Russia's economic problems, nobody would argue with that things are bad in Russia when it comes to the economics. The question is compared to what? Well, compared to the Soviet Union, maybe not so bad. Compared to how bad it could be in Russia, well, maybe not so bad. Compared to Poland, most certainly Russia's doing much worse in this transition than we would have expected. But that's just one question. That's just one thing that's going on in Russia. There's also elections coming up. You mentioned that. That means, well, on the democracy front, things are not as bad as we might think.
All right, just hold that thought. Leon?
We cannot say that things are bad in a country which comes out of about 1,000 years of authoritarianism, 3/4 of a century of communist tyranny, dictatorship, Stalinism essentially, and at the same time has held 3 free and fair presidential one presidential, 2 parliamentary, 1 referendum. These are national elections. And now has elected governors in 89 regions, again, and local legislatures. This is the problem with this who lost Russia debate, is that it's completely ahistorical, and if you allow me to say it, ageographical. It's taken, Russia is being compared to the United States and Western Europe instead of being compared to its own history and to its own neighborhood.
All right. Lynn Nelson, I gather you're somewhat more skeptical than these optimists here.
In addition to the problems you mentioned at the very start, one of the more troubling signs that I see is the nature of public opinion itself. Because it's people who are doing the voting, it's people who are going to determine what the outcomes of the next elections are. And those signs have been worsening for some time now, so that at the present time,
worsening in what sense?
well, at the present time, the Russian people overall are nostalgic for the Brezhnev era. Not only
How do you measure that, Lynn?
SIOM, which is the largest public opinion research organization in Russia. They've been asking people now for several years, do you think you'd prefer to live in that time or this time? And what they've been finding is that
going up.
It's going up, and this year it was 58% who said they would prefer the Brezhnev period to today. And a full 50% now express negative opinions about multi-party elections. The dissatisfaction I'm talking about gets to the heart of democracy and free market. I think it can be said with no question that in the early 1990s, Russian people, for the most part, were excited, enthusiastic, and ripe for free market and for democracy, and that mood has changed. It has changed in both the cities and the countryside.
What happened?
Well, the mood's changed, but that's what happens in all revolutions, and I think that's what we need to remember. I teach a course at Stanford on revolutions, and throughout history, it doesn't matter if you're French, Russian, Angolan, South African, the moment when you're in opposition, you finally topple the Ancient regime, that's when expectations are incredibly high. And it's, I was living in Russia at that time. It was an incredibly euphoric time. And everybody thought overnight.
The year was 1991?
1991, 1990, 91. I mean, I went to those giant demonstrations, 800,000 people on the street every weekend to protest, brought down communism. And then everybody expected, well, now the revolution's over. Now we're going to have 2 cars and live like they do on TV, watching Santa Barbara soap operas, as we all were back there in Russia. Well, it didn't happen that way. Now, the problem with the expectations is worsened still by one Yeltsin, who told the people it's going to last 7 to 8 months, and then we're going to live better. And 2, by the West. We promised them lots of aid. We told them it's going to make this transition easy, and then we didn't deliver on that aid, and it's been a much longer process. But I think it is important to remember, this is the biggest change, I think, transformation, politically, economically, borders of the state, in the history of the modern world. We're only 7 or 8 years into this revolution. I think it's wrong to expect that we would be at the end of this revolutionary process.
Okay, second question. We're all agreed that things are a long way from perfect and haven't worked out as well as most people had hoped. Whose fault? Who's to blame for this?
Ultimately, Russia is to blame, but a large qualification needs to be added to that, because Russia followed some of the tracks that it has followed with strong urging from other people. So when Russia was looking to create a free market, where do they look? They look to places such as our country where markets exist. And they heavily followed some of our advice, not all of it, and this is a deep subject, but some of it. And we gave some very bad advice. So
you are referring to Professor Jeffrey Sachs, among others?
I'm referring to the general approach of rapid privatization without controls, without building law before we...
This was also the position taken by the man who is now the Secretary of Treasury, Larry Summers, who was then with the World Bank.
That's right.
And they were in favor of what is called shock therapy?
Yes, and rapid privatization into whatever hands the property might fall. They were in favor of allowing this kind of process to develop with very little care to prevent corruption.
And you think, not only retrospectively, but from that time...
At the time it was being written about by not only me, but several others
saying
also.
It's a mistake.
Yes, this isn't retrospective. This is things we were saying at that time as well.
I beg to differ here. We all know that it's very difficult to build capitalism in a democracy the mode of privatization, contrary to the established opinion, at least in our mass media, the mode of privatization actually chosen in Russia was extremely mild therapy. In the end, 51% of all the stocks in about 90,000 enterprises went to the managers and the workers. I mean, this is a social...
On the privatization, the workers didn't get their shares, but
No.
it wasn't the fault of the reformers.
No.
It was the fault of the directors who
Yeah, but
took control
if
of those
the
things.
reformers perpetrated reform and didn't manage to control these red directors who then diverted the funds, and isn't it sort of the fault of the people who set it in motion if they didn't follow through?
You would have
No,
to have
no,
a
no.
civil war, Ben.
Let's
you
go
can't
back.
send armed detachment to every factory and dislodge every director.
Let's go
that was
back
the
to the-
greatest dilemma of privatization.
No, that wasn't the greatest dilemma. The greatest dilemma was what to do with this huge amount of state property as we try to make it private. Now, the Supreme Soviet had one plan, and that plan was to truly privatize to the people of Russia to prevent them from selling their shares in these companies for at least 3 years. That plan was scuttled by Chubais and his advisors in favor of the kind of plan that was adopted.
That's
The
just not,
Supreme
hold on,
Soviet-
that's just not true. The
It certainly is
privatization
true.
law was passed in June 1992.
The Supreme Soviet did
Supreme
not-
Soviet.
By the Supreme
no,
Soviet.
this is
Wow.
one
They
of the
certainly
this
did.
is one of the mistakes that many people are making in history today. The Supreme Soviet never approved that part of the plan. That was changed by Chubais, and it was changed and implemented through Yeltsin's decree.
Let me ask a question of you, Lynn Nelson. Isn't it possible, and I sense this is what I'm hearing on this side of the room, that this apparent economic anarchy is, as we speak, as ugly as it may be, growing what we call capitalism?
I actually, if I could, I want to distinguish between two things, because this debate needs to get out of the kind of shock therapy versus not.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't help the story. I think you need to talk about two things. You need to talk about what economists call macroeconomic stabilization, which is basically stopping inflation, balancing the budget. That's one set of things. That's what macroeconomists do. Privatization is what microeconomists do. That's getting property rights to get right at the enterprise level. I think 10 years out now in these post-communist transitions, the overwhelming data, economic data, shows if you get the budget right, if you stop inflation, if you get macroeconomic stabilization, that's the best way to get economic growth. And the countries that did that, Poland and Hungary, are much better off than the countries that didn't. But there isn't an economic relationship there. And so to bundle it all together and say Russia failed with shock therapy because they failed with shock therapy, to me is just such a gross injustice to the real story of what went on in Russia.
It isn't that simple. One thing that needs to be pointed out when we talk about Poland and other countries of the former Soviet bloc is those countries had nothing like the level of state ownership that the USSR had. They had nothing like the centralization and specialization of manufacture that the Soviet Union had. They had nothing like the level of corruption that the communist government had. So we're talking about apples and oranges here.
How bad is the corruption now? I mean, every society has aspects of corruption, some more, some worse. Many of them proceed for decades, generations, and centuries, and do, except for the fact that somebody's skimming money, they do just fine. Is this what is going on in Russia, or is it so deep and so endemic that it is just distorting the whole system?
Ben, I think there are several factors. I mean, and again, I don't want to be Panglossian. I mean, I think
That's my job.
Right. I think the elite is very corrupt. But there are several. There's history, there's geography, and then there is political economy. History is that yes, the country has been corrupt. I mean, you read Marquis de Custine, who traveled there in 1840. Corrupt, completely corrupt. Compared. I mean, France has its problems, but compared to France, the neighbors come and pick the carcass. And the problem is that in every single country, be it South America, Asia, be it South Korea, be it Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, even Britain under Thatcher, corruption immediately becomes one of the main issues in public opinion and in politics. In other words, apart from the fault, and this is not to abet or excuse the personally guilty, I think there are very important structural problems for that corruption to emerge. And here the geography and history and the transfer of immense national wealth from the state that guarded it with guns to private owners, semi-private owners, soft owners, hard owners, immediately produces a great deal of corruption. And the real question, Ben, is this. Speaking of curves, the real question is whether the Russian corruption is really what I call a systemically fatal. In other words, will it go Colombian, Venezuelan way?
Hold on, that's what we're going to come to. Let's move into part 3. Now,
or whether it be an Italian model, where you could coexist with 25% of taxes not paid and still become a thriving economy.
The situation has been described very well. Corruption was present at the time the Soviet Union was dismantled, and that needed to be recognized. It needs now to be recognized as well. It wasn't recognized well then, and that's why the privatization program failed so badly, because it should have been seen that these vultures were going to come, and that's why steps were needed. Today, steps are needed also. The situation is worse now than it was then. Corruption is more rampant than it was then.
Did America, in our role as a newfound good friend, did we make any effort to point that corruption out and to stop it?
Quite the contrary. We largely closed our eyes to it. It was pointed out by analysts, and most of that was ignored by both American and Russian policymakers.
Will someone tell us the story of Vice President Gore and the so-called barnyard epithet? Are you familiar with what I'm talking about?
Well, allegedly, right, he did get a memo from the CIA saying there is this corruption with Mr. Chernomyrdin, the Prime Minister, and he wrote a word that I don't think I should say on television.
Right.
The question, I think, there are two questions there. There's one, how deep is corruption in Russia, and I think we should be very concerned about that, and we should do everything we can to expose it. But the second question is about the
Gore's position, as I sense it, admittedly that's a pretty brief statement, but wasn't he saying in effect, look, this is the nation that for 70 years was our sworn adversary. It still has thousands of nuclear weapons. It is absolutely critical that we be on their side and on board. Don't bother me with $1 billion here or $1 billion here. There is a greater task before us, and let's just cool it. I mean, is that in effect what you would divine his position was?
I think so, and I think it raises a question because there's corruption in Russia, of course. There are corrupt, the biggest oligarch in China is the Chinese military. They're the most corrupt organization in China. The head of that country, for instance, puts people in jail because they have religious beliefs. Does that mean that the President of the United States shouldn't be meeting with the President of China? We met with Soviet leaders who committed huge atrocities. Millions and millions of people were killed by those gentlemen, general secretaries of the Communist Party, and yet our presidents continued to meet with them.
But meeting with presidents is not quite the same as what we have done with Boris Yeltsin. We have put in Boris Yeltsin the personification of democracy in Russia, the personification of future hope for Russia, and that was a huge mistake on our part. We should never have personalized it the way we did. That's much more than meeting with Yeltsin, and we've done that consistently in the last several years.
Leon, you're Yeltsin's biographer.
Well, I'm always puzzled by this business about we put a great deal of, the Russian people put a great deal of stock in Yeltsin. In revolutions, Ben, people matter. I mean, it's true that Yeltsin probably, starting with 98, I would say, the stars started to set. But in de Gaulle mattered, Churchill mattered, Lincoln mattered, maybe for a short period of time. In revolutions, they matter. Yeltsin was by far the best hope for democratic Russia, and I think the time will show that he has left a mixed but a very, very important legacy.
Let's play a little game. We have to get out now. This is 1999. Let's make believe it's 2009. Let's look ahead 10 years from now, and I say, Mike, how are things in Russia? The year is 2009. What would you guess you would say?
Well, the two things that worry me, I guess, about the future, I think the trajectory are on the right direction on democracy, on markets, and on imperialism. We haven't talked much about that, but we don't have this messianic imperial power in Russia today. And I think if you look at public attitudes and elite attitudes, there is a much greater consensus on all three of those issues most certainly than there was 10 years ago. The two things that worry me a lot are, one, oligarchic capitalism That is, do the big guys that have controlled the big resources in Russia continue to do that and push to the side the small business person, push to the side what I would call real competitive market economy? That's number one. And number two, what I would call creeping authoritarianism. I'm less worried about the Bolsheviks coming into power in some revolutionary situation. What I'm really worried about is that a set of consensus guys come together, win this next election, and then through a quiet way break down the press, through a quiet way arrest the opposition. And so you'll still have elections, but not competitive elections.
Leon, I asked for a scenario and I got an analysis of, on the one hand,
Right,
on the other hand, it's a common academic disease.
Only fools predict 10 years of history,
okay,
but real fools do it when you're talking about revolutionary Russia today.
Well, I'll be a real fool.
You'll be a real fool.
I'll be a real
Okay.
fool, and
Tell
I
me where we're
hope
gonna
then you'll
be.
remember that,
Right, okay.
the things I'm doing for you. It's Italy in the 1960s. Tremendous disparity, say, as between Palermo and Milan, between Russian
Disparities
countryside.
of wealth.
Disparities of wealth,
Right.
well-being, openness to the West, progress. Kind of corrupt or semi-corrupt governors of regions. Elections are held. The parliament is very difficult and fractured. Presidential power most likely diminished compared to what we have now through constitutional amendments. The press is boisterous, free. People are free to express their opinions. Everybody is moaning and groaning and dissatisfied. The economy is growing 3-4% a year.
So you're saying 10 years from now we will have continued chaos along with economic growth?
Continued non-fatal chaos at the local level, and pretty much well-established democracy, not of the Anglo-Saxon, Western European type, but Southern European type.
Now, to close this show, we hear from our Kevorkian figure here. Now, why don't you tell me what it's going to be like 10 years from now?
Mike referred to creeping authoritarianism. It isn't creeping, it's rampant right now. And all the signs are negative in terms of the development of democratization, because Yeltsin now has more power than the presidents of both the US and France combined, as someone recently said. A constitution that is made for a dictator, for someone who uses authoritarian power. So Russia has got to reverse its current trend. It's got to reverse the corruption trends. It's got to reverse the life expectancy trends. It needs to reverse the people's disillusionment with democracy. Can it happen? It can happen. But what bothers me is Russia is further from that today than it was in 1992. It's getting further and further every year from that. So it could be reversed, but reversal is what's needed. My two friends are talking about a trajectory that's upward. I'm not seeing that upward trajectory. And if you look at the hard data, I think you'll find it hard to see an upward trajectory. So it can be reversed, but it's going to be hard.
At least we have a divergence of opinion, which is what programs like this are about. Thank you very much, Lynn Nelson, Michael McFaul, and Leon Aron. And thank you. We encourage feedback from our viewers, particularly via email. It is very, very important to us. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
We at Think Tank depend on your views to make our show better. Please send your questions and comments to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036, or email us at thinktank@pbs.org. To learn more about Think Tank, visit PBS online at www.pbs.org. And please let us know where you watch Think Tank.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.